So I'm going to start and end the presentation, and Dan's going to do the sort of meaty bit in the middle. We'll talk a little bit about what we mean by authentic assessment, because you might be surprised to hear that this isn't necessarily agreed on throughout the sector. A little bit about what motivated us to do this study. The study was a survey, and Dan will talk about that and the results, and then the gap analysis that we did on our assessments for our curriculum and how that panned out. And then I'll come back to talk a bit about the limitations at the end. So what is authentic assessment? Well, as I say, people do squabble a bit over what this means, but what we're talking about here is assessments that involve some element of realism. So assessments that involve the students doing something that is relevant to everyday professional life. So a task, for example, that they might have to do as a forensic practitioner. I forgot to introduce myself, but I'm Hilary Hamnett and I come from a practice background, and I'm a forensic toxicologist by training. And Dan, do you want to do your?
Yeah, I think I'd better introduce myself. So I'm Dan Matthews. I'm currently the program leader for the forensic science course at Lincoln. My background is as a practitioner of 20 plus years experience at the FSS, key forensic services, etc. So I've been in higher education for about 6 years now.
Okay, so we're thinking really about tasks that you might be expected to do in the workplace, in a forensic science workplace. And it's about students showing that they can do something. So if we want our students to be able to use a microscope, we don't want them to write us an essay on how to use a microscope. We want them to show us in the lab that they can use a microscope to do some sort of professional task. And this is partly to help prepare students for what's out there, prepare them for what's going to happen in the workplace. But also there is a lot of evidence that in the research and also just anecdotally that students quite like authentic assessments. They find them more engaging and they find them more interesting than the usual write-in exam sort of assessment. But as we probably all know, anything that's authentic can often be very, very time consuming. So it is a lot more time consuming to do authentic assessments than it is to do other sorts of assessments. So why we did this study? So during COVID, probably like most universities, we put all of our exams online. So they became open book online exams. And post-COVID, we were under pressure from our university, probably like many others, to not go back to traditional sorts of assessment and keep the online assessment. And partly this was for educational reasons. So there are some good educational reasons to do online open book exams, but let's be honest, a lot of it was what I've euphemistically called logistical. So the university quite like not paying for printing, they quite like not paying for invigilators. So that was really the driving force behind sticking with these online exams. And what we wanted to do was look at, are there any sorts of other assessments we could introduce instead? So if we're going to move away from face-to-face exams, what could we do instead that isn't just having an exam online? And also we wanted to broaden the concept a bit of authentic assessment. So there's the workplace task side of it, but there's also the fact that when students finish with us for their undergraduate degree and they go into a forensic workplace, they're not just going to be given a case on day one. They're going to have a lot more training and assessment themselves when they get into the workplace. And we need to make sure that we're preparing students for that further assessment they're going to have. So it might seem like a great idea to get rid of all the face-to-face written exams, but then if the students encounter that in the workplace and they haven't done an exam since GCSE, that's not actually preparing them for the workplace. So we wanted to think a bit more broadly about this concept. And as we said already, so we come from a limited number of disciplines within forensic science. We wanted to make sure we were capturing what's happening in other disciplines and also what's been happening perhaps more recently than the last time both of us did an assessment in the workplace. So the survey was online. We used the platform JISC just because that's the one the university tells us we have to use. We did get ethics to do it. It was open really over the summer in 2022, and it was aimed at any practitioners in forensic science from any discipline in the UK and internationally. So it was quite broad, and we used social media to get it out to networks. It was anonymous, so we tried not to collect any personal identifiable data. You will see shortly when Dan talks about the countries that were represented that not everybody answered that question. So there were some questions where people perhaps thought they could be identifiable because maybe there's only one forensic service provider in that country. So sometimes we missed out on a few answers, but we tried not to collect identifiable data. And as I say, we distributed it through our networks, and we got 60 people respond. Not all questions were answered by all participants, but you can see in the paper the full list of questions and also the numbers of people who answered each one. So I'll pass over to Dan.
Okay, so I shall be doing the old next slide thing for Hilary here. So what we basically did is we got some data that we got back, and probably not surprisingly, we've got quite a lot of practitioners working within the DNA body fluid sector, because that's one of the largest sort of areas of practice worldwide now, and then toxicology with a little bit of trace evidence in there as well, and that kind of reflected, I think, partly the networks that Hilary and I have across our social media platforms and the people that we've worked with historically over the years. So most of it will be sort of in relation to that sort of side of things. Only a few CSI, which is interesting. So most of these sorts of areas we're dealing with are probably going to be sort of lab-based in the main, which is kind of what you would hope to sort of expect. I mean, obviously competency testing now with the advent of the regulators' codes of practice and accreditation for eventually, the idea is all disciplines, will be that these sorts of things will become more important. So moving on to the next slide. So across the global sort of outreach that we had, as expected, we had the largest sort of load of participants came from the UK, and we have a few from around Europe, which is because I have an involvement with the one of the MC expert working groups, so I've got an outreach there, and then we've got quite a few from Canada and the US, and Hilary's managed to pick up some from ESR, which is where she used to work in New Zealand. So we've managed to get quite a nice outreach across various different parts of the world through our various networks that we have open to us. So when we got the results coming back from the sorts of things that we were interested in, really was how are people assessed? So, you know, we all have our own experience in terms of what workplace authentic workplace assessment is like, and certainly those of us that have been in practice will know the sorts of ranges and things that we deal with here, and unexpectedly for me, most of these sorts of practical skills assessments will be done by observation. It's surprising that we get some that will do unobserved competency test and observed competency tests as well. Some of them, depending on the discipline, will obviously involve some calculation. So if you're going to be doing things like drink driving cases and working out percentages and things like that, or we might be doing t-testing for groupings of different types of results and so on. So you need to be able to obviously make sure that whoever's doing that is able to do it effectively. Now, rather worryingly, we get the odd one where there is effectively no practical training. So basically, it is previous experience that is coming through as the main theme here, and that's, I think, probably in certain areas where it's not sure which areas it would necessarily be in, but in some areas and in some countries, it could be you have X years of experience, and so it's just assumed that you're competent to do that, which of course in the UK and in my experience is something that we wouldn't take, certainly not now. And then occasionally the odd two saying that they had no practical training. So that's quite interesting as well. So other things that we had open to us were things like exams that were specific to the field of study, carrying out case reviews or carrying out mock cases and things like that, or doing peer reviews. So if somebody comes with a set of training records, for instance, and they've got extensive experience, then they may be asked to carry out peer reviewing of documents just to see if they're spotting the errors and mistakes and things like that. But I think the interesting thing for previous experience would be that, as I just said, it could be the fact that an individual has worked for an accredited organisation will have a set of training records which demonstrates their skills and abilities to work in that particular area, which can be used. So it's gone.
Alicia's put a couple of questions in the chat.
Yeah, okay. Go on.
So how did you decide on the questions? I'd love to say that we used some sort of highfalutin academic technique, but we kind of just made them up, really. So we broadly distinguished between our practical teaching and our theory teaching. That was really the road we wanted to go down, was what's the difference. And actually, you'll see in the next slide that some people combine the two. So quite a lot of labs, they do them together, whereas we tend to do them individually. I will come on to what additional questions we would ask again in the limitations bit. And then, so unobserved competency tests. So we didn't define this, but I think what I imagine this is somebody just being told, go off to the lab and do this, and then bring me the results later, rather than it being online. But I suppose that is a good point. We didn't actually distinguish between whether someone was in person or online.
It would have been quite interesting, I think, to have information about what particular competency tests or what particular assessments were being done when it comes to those particular ones, because I think there are some that you can probably do online or remotely that are going to be reasonable, and others that really are not. So I think it's interesting to maybe have had that a little bit more information there.
Yeah.
Okay, should we crack on? Okay. So again, with the theoretical knowledge, obviously we've got a sort of a different range of different things here. So some of them will be assessed with practical skills. So a lot of reporting casework, especially, and I think this is pretty standard. Certainly what I've experienced is practice statements or reports. So obviously that's key. And I remember I used to put forward, certainly with all the areas that I trained in, I would have to put forward a portfolio of a portfolio of statements or reports that I'd put together as practice to demonstrate that I'm able to communicate effectively and I'm able to interpret the results effectively. It's interesting to see we do have closed book exams in the theoretical knowledge. I certainly did when I was at the FSS, and I think this is one of the things to show, interestingly, that the closed book exams, contrary to popular belief in some universities, actually do have a place. And it's interesting when we were discussing these things in relation to do we bring back exams after COVID was the aspect of discussing this with the Chartered Society to see what they thought about it. Obviously, mock courts is another one that's routinely done. So be that through Bond Solon, for instance, you come and do various things, or be that the old style FSS expert witness course, which was interesting. Presentations, of course, is another one. We expect those, along with the vivas, to be, you need to have that recall. You need to be able to demonstrate your expertise and knowledge via verbal communication, because otherwise, how are you going to get on giving evidence in court, essentially, when it comes to that? And then various others as well. So it's quite an interesting range here. And it's surprising when Hilary comes on to talk about limitations a bit later on, and when we talk about the gap analysis, sort of where do we fit in terms of what we teach right now? How many of these areas do we actually assess? And you can probably see by this that we actually probably assess quite a few of these sorts of ways. So it's interesting. And yeah, Lisa, it's interesting to see when you talk about reflective writing. This is something I never was involved with until I started doing my PG Cert HE, when I had to start doing that. And I know that in certain areas, particularly I think NHS are starting to do much more reflective practice when it comes to professional portfolios. So yeah, that was a little bit interesting for me as well. Should we move on to the next one, please? Okay, so what we did once we had all of these pieces of information is we had a look at the course structure that we run here at Lincoln, and we looked at what the responses we got from the survey were, and really to see where we meet these different sort of assessment types within the course and how many times we come across them as well. So we started looking at, if you look at the paper, you'll see the results in a little bit more detail here. But you can see when we're dealing with things like assessed as part of practical skills training and competency tests, we actually have quite a few of those within the course. So we have 4 modules that we run, and within those modules, we run essentially practical skills training or assessments in there as well. Practice statements and reports. Again, we cover these in all 3 years of the undergraduate degree, starting off looking at things like streamlined forensic reporting in year 1, a witness statement based upon a relatively straightforward examination in year 2, and in year 3 I get my fire and explosion students to write a scene statement on a fire, one of the ones that I would have been to, so I give them a set of my photographs to do, which is quite interesting. And then, of course, the closed book exam stuff is essentially one of those areas that we get a little bit of pushback from the university, as Hilary said at the beginning. So I think we kind of used this really to sort of go ahead and say that you need to have this recall. If you're stood in the witness box, you can't use Google to look all your stuff up, and you can't take along piles of textbooks. You have to have that inherent knowledge to be able to present it. So it's important for the students that they can understand that that is important. We're not just giving them exams for the sake of being mean to them. We're giving them exams for the sake that they need to have that essential recall.
If you're in a crime scene with no reception.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can't just look up.
So in our 2022-23 round, we had 50 overall assessments within the course. 3 of those were competency tests, or what we would perceive or define to be competency tests if we understand them. A maths test. We don't really contain any observations for those. We do 1 or 2 when it comes to some of the crime scene investigation modules, but we don't really do any lab-based observations when it comes to that. So that's sort of one of the areas that we have a bit of a shortfall in, and maybe could do with a bit better, because students really don't like being watched what they're doing. Do you know what I mean? It's one of those things where, particularly when it's sort of like they feel as though they're on trial a bit. But I think it's something that certainly with the way things seem to be going at the moment, I think it's important that they have that experience to hopefully sort of build on resilience, which is something that, of course, we try to do as well, is to give them the skills and the ability to be able to work effectively within that kind of environment and under the kind of pressure that we're all used to working within the criminal justice system. So we have some theoretical knowledge that we looked at here. So obviously we've got plenty of closed book exams within our course. We have a number of practice statements and reports, which is good to see, not just at each level, but also at varying different complexities and different areas as well. So it gives the students the ability to do lab-based statements, but also a scene-based statement as well, which is quite interesting as well. We do a mock court at level 6. So in our final year, we do a mock court for them. And we do allow assessment of theory during competency tests as well. That's something we embed in the fibers one that we have in the second year as well. And
so we'd encourage anybody who's running one of these courses or a master's course to do your own audit, and we have put the full data set on Figshare, which is should be freely available. So if anybody wants to have a look at the full data set, so if you run a specific masters or something and you want to look at in that area what are the common assessment types that are used, then yeah, please do have a look at the data. So
just seen Rachel's put on a couple of interests, or there's a couple of bits that Alicia and Rachel put some bits on pieces there. So yeah, the personal reflection thing in mitigating to some extent against the use of AI, I think that's something that we're really keen about, is how do we, I think it's one of those things where a lot of universities certainly here, it seems to be, they're not really sure quite what to do with AI still. I think it's one of those things where the policy is not clear. And I remember coming to Chartered Society of Forensic Sciences conference a couple of years ago, where one of the talks was about embracing AI with use to help students develop their knowledge of areas, because that's interesting. From what I see, certainly is obvious one. I think to me, when people have used AI and haven't understood the subject area because they don't understand the questions to ask, and therefore they don't understand that what they're getting out from the AI is any good or not. And also you said saw an open book during COVID decline in knowledge retention. I would tend to agree with that. Students like to have these open book exams. They perceive them to be easier, and so they want to have those sorts of things as well. So it's interesting. We don't generally include defence statements in our assessments at the moment, so we don't generally give them a sort of a defence scenario from that point of view, which is something that could be
interesting idea.
Yeah, I like that idea. Is that there are ways that we can potentially give them a statement to write and then give them a defence statement and see what they do with it. That might be quite interesting to do.
Okay, so I'll just wrap up with our limitations. So we did cover quite a lot of disciplines, but I'm sure there were some that we missed, so we weren't able to get everyone who works in every area. And obviously, as Dan and I were saying, it was skewed quite heavily towards the areas that we worked in. We didn't ask people what their job title was, so we don't know if we're getting, people from across the board, or whether we had largely junior people or people who were very experienced. So that was something that I think we would ask if we did this again. We would ask. Some of the responses were quite old, so it's possible that some of this information is a bit out of date. So this is a graph of the years since they undertook their last assessment, and the biggest one was in the year that the survey was distributed. So that was quite good. So 35%, but we did have some that were over 10 years old. So it's possible that that's not really something we should be relying on anymore if the last time they did the assessment was 10 years old. Other things we might ask would be people who are actually doing the training, rather than the trainee. We might think about, are you doing training, and what sort of techniques do you use, and why might that be, and so on. It's going to be very difficult to address some of the gaps that we identified. So, for example, standing over, having a member of staff standing over every student to do something for 10, 15 minutes. We just don't have the resources to do that. There might be some ways that we could use technology to do it, get them to make a video or something, but there's nothing you can't quite recreate UCAS standing over you while you do something. So that's going to be a difficult one to address. And we do have to be realistic that not all of our students are going to go into a forensic science role. So we're not advocating that everybody completely overhauls all their assessments in order to prepare all of the students on their course to go into forensic science. We know that quite a few of them will go into other things. We need to make sure that they've got a range of transferable skills, a range of experiences for different assessments. And also the idea is not to recreate workplace training in higher education. So the two things are different. They don't have the same role at all. There's some overlap, but the purpose of them is quite different. So my experience of working in practice, I worked with some really good people who hadn't been to university, and they were really very good at following an SOP, and they were really good at their jobs, but they had very poor understanding of why they were doing certain things. So they were great at just following the process, getting the result, but if you ask them why they did something, they just wouldn't be able to say. And whereas our graduates, we would expect them to understand why something is being done the way it is. And also that theory, that detailed theoretical understanding, is not something that would necessarily be part of workplace training. But again, we would expect our graduates to come out of their degree with a detailed understanding of the theory. And that's it from us. So thank you very much. I'll stop sharing so we can make it a bit easier to answer questions.